Hey everyone, welcome back. This is a place where we share strange, creepy, and sometimes deeply unsettling stories people have experienced in real life through Reddit. The kind of stories that stick with you long after you hear them. Some of them are eerie, some of them are disturbing, and some of them are the kind of moments where someone realizes they came dangerously close to something they never should have witnessed. Tonight's first story is one of those. When the storyteller was a teenager, they went through a pretty typical goth phase. Black hair, black clothes, black makeup, the whole aesthetic. They even had a pair of heavy combat boots that they wore everywhere. And like a lot of goth teenagers back then, the storyteller and their friends had a strange favorite hangout spot, the local cemetery. Now, before you picture something out of a horror movie, the truth is it started mostly as a joke. A bunch of teenagers sitting around in the cemetery felt edgy and dramatic at the time. But after a while, they realized something. The cemetery was actually kind of peaceful. It was quiet, no crowds, just open space and silence. So eventually, it became their regular place to hang out and talk. But one night completely changed how they saw the place. One evening, one of their friends called and asked if they wanted to hang out. Most other friends weren't available. Some were working and others were recovering from partying the night before. So it ended up being just the two of them. The friend picked them up in her car and, like usual, they drove to the cemetery. They parked near one of the hills and started doing what they always did, talking, smoking cigarettes, mostly venting about life. That night, the friend was going on and on about the latest drama with her boyfriend. Normal teenage conversations. Nothing unusual until something caught their attention. At the top of the hill, about 100 feet away, there was a bonfire. Now, the cemetery sat only about a block away from a major university campus, so it wasn't unusual for college students to wander over there at night. Sometimes they drank, sometimes they hung out, so seeing people around wasn't exactly shocking. Still, a bonfire was different. The kind of thing usually meant police might show up. Being inside the cemetery after dark was illegal, so the two of them sighed and agreed that they'd probably need to leave soon. They decided to finish their cigarettes first and then head out. But then something happened. A smell started drifting down the hill from the direction of the fire, and it was horrible. Not normal smoke, something thick, foul, and nauseous. Something thick and foul. The friend immediately gagged and covered her mouth. What the hell is that? The narrator said. The friend shook her head, clearly disgusted. I don't know what they're doing, but let's just go. So they got up and headed to the car. They got inside and were about to leave when one of them suggested something. And later, neither of them could even remember who said it. Maybe we should go up there and see what they're doing. The narrator immediately felt their stomach twist. A cool shiver ran down their spine. And apparently, the friend felt exactly the same because at the exact same moment, they both said the same thing. No, we should just leave. The friend started the car and turned on the headlights. She put the car in reverse and looked over her shoulder to back up. But the narrator was still looking up the hill. And that's when they saw something. A figure stepped in front of the bonfire, just a dark silhouette against the flames. But there was no mistaking it. The person was standing there, watching them. At the moment, a wave of panic hit. Go, the narrator said quietly, then louder. With each word, their voice got more frantic. The friend glanced up the hill, and just as the figure started walking towards the car, she slammed the gas pedal. The car shot backwards down the hill, gravel flying everywhere, and she quickly threw the gear into drive and sped towards the exit of the cemetery. Neither of them spoke for a while. They were both trying to process what had just happened. Finally, the friend broke the silence. What the hell were they burning? The narrator just shook their head. I don't know. Eventually, she dropped them off at home and the narrator went inside and went to bed. Still unsettled, but trying not to think too much about it, They assumed it was just something weird college kids were doing, but the next morning proved otherwise. The narrator woke up and walked into the kitchen. Their mom was already there drinking her morning coffee. They joined her and started chatting about normal things, her job, her plans for the day, and suddenly their mom asked a question. Did you hear what happened last night? The narrator shrugged. They had literally just woken up. No, what happened? Their mom explained that a woman she worked with had been kidnapped the night before. She had been taken from a parking garage, and the narrator immediately asked, "Oh my god, did they find her?" Their mom nodded slowly. Yes, but it's too late. Whoever had kidnapped her had raped and murdered her. And early that morning, police had discovered her body. Where? In the cemetery. The killer had tried to dispose of her body in a bonfire. At that moment, the narrator froze. Their minds started racing. Everything suddenly clicked. The smell, the fire, the silhouette standing on the hill watching them, that smile drifting down towards them the night before, that's what it was. After that night, they never hung out in that cemetery again. And sometimes they still think about that moment in the car when they briefly considered walking up that hill to see what was happening. Because if they had made that choice, there's no telling how that night might have ended. Stories like that always make me think about how strange it is. You can be living a completely normal day, doing something ordinary, and suddenly stumble onto something you were never meant to see. And sometimes it's not even in a creepy place like a cemetery. Sometimes it's just the middle of nowhere. This next story happens in rural Australia, and honestly, the situation starts off pretty normal. Just a job, a hot day, and a drive across a huge farm. But it turns into something way more disturbing. When the storyteller was 19, they worked for a company that sent temporary laborers out to farms in rural parts of Australia. The way it worked was pretty simple. You'd tell the company when you were available and they'd send you out to some remote farm for a few weeks to help with whatever work needed doing. It was long hours and hard work, but the pay was good, and if you get along with the other workers, it could actually be a pretty fun experience. At the time this happened, they were working on a massive property, and when I say massive, I mean massive. They were told that the farm covered roughly the same land area as the entire state of Maryland in the US. It was located about 9 hours away from Sydney, and even once you were on the property itself, the nearest town was still about 40 minutes away. So basically, it was the middle of nowhere. The narrator was working there with three other guys around the same age, all from the city. Their boss was the farm owner, a guy named Jeremy. Jeremy was pretty laid back and generally treated them well. He worked alongside them most days and kept an eye on things. One particular summer day was brutally hot. The temperature had climbed to around 38 degrees Celsius, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. After a long meeting of clearing bushland, Jeremy decided they'd earned a break. He told them he knew about a water hole on the property about 25 minutes north that would be perfect for cooling off. The narrator immediately liked the idea of a swim, but the other guys were too tired and just wanted to relax back at the house. So it ended up being just Jeremy and the narrator heading out. They hopped into one of the work trucks and started driving across the property. The land around them was mostly wide open, flat fields with scattered patches of bushland here and there. Jeremy wasn't much of a tall guy, so much of the drive was quiet. Just the truck engine and the endless empty landscape stretching out in every direction. After about 20 minutes, though, Jeremy suddenly nudged him in the ribs. Do you see that over there, beneath those two dead trees? Now, if you've ever seen inland Australia, you'll know the landscape is mostly brown or red dirt. There isn't much color out there, so anything bright really stands out, and that's exactly why this thing caught their attention. Far off in the distance was a large blue structure. It looked completely out of place. Curious, Jeremy steered the truck toward it. As they got closer, they realized what it was. A huge blue shipping container just sitting there alone in the middle of this enormous empty property. Jeremy looked confused. He said he hadn't seen anything like it the last time he drove through that area, which had only been about 5 weeks earlier, so naturally he wanted to go check it out. They parked the truck about 100 meters away at first, and right away the narrator got a bad feeling. It's hard to explain, but seeing something so unnatural sitting in such a barren place just didn't feel right. Jeremy, on the other hand, was more curious than worried. After all, it was his farm. If someone had dumped something there, technically they were trespassing. So they slowly drove closer, and that's when things got even stranger. Behind the container was a big diesel generator, loudly thumping away. Each side of the container had a CCTV camera mounted on it, and they were motion activated. As the two of them moved around the container, the cameras followed them. At this point, the narrator suggested maybe they should just leave. Something along the lines of, if someone put all this security here, they probably don't want people messing with it. But Jeremy brushed that off. He reminded him again this was his property. If anything, whoever put the container there was the one breaking the rules. So he decided they were going inside. Despite all the cameras and equipment, the door only had a small padlock on it. Jeremy grabbed some bolt cutters from the truck. After a bit of effort, the lock snapped. They opened the door, and the first thing they noticed was the cool air rushing out. The container was fully air conditioned, which actually felt pretty nice compared to the brutal heat outside. Inside, the space was dim but filled with blinking lights and a constant humming noise. It sounded like hard drives running. Eventually, they found the light switch, and when the lights flicked on, they realized they were standing inside some kind of a computer setup. The walls were lined with massive hard drives, some as big as mini fridges. There were stacks of electronics everywhere. Plastic storage containers piled near the back wall, and in the center of the room were several desks with computer monitors and rolling office chairs. It looked like someone had built a full office inside a shipping container in the middle of nowhere. At this point, the narrator felt like they were in a dream. None of it made sense. They sat down at the desk and started clicking around the computers, hoping to figure out what the place was for. But neither of them really understood what they were looking at. The screens were full of complicated lists and data transfers. The best way he described it later was that it looked like those old file sharing programs from years ago, constantly sending and receiving data. After a while, he gave up trying to understand the computers. Instead, he walked over to the pile of storage boxes at the back of the container. Even though the place seemed empty, he still felt on edge. But curiosity got the better of him. He opened one of those boxes, and almost immediately he realized something was horribly wrong. Inside, there were stacks of posters, DVDs, and photographs, all of them containing illegal and deeply disturbing material involving children. What made it even worse was how organized everything was. Folders, small boxes, everything carefully sorted. He said the moment he realized what he was looking at, he felt sick to his stomach. He slammed the box shut and rushed over to Jeremy. Barely able to get the words out, he told him they needed to leave. Immediately, they ran out of the container, jumped into the truck, and drove straight back to the farmhouse. There was no mobile phone signal anywhere on the property, and they didn't have the satellite phone with them either. So the only way to contact anyone was the landline back at the house. Once they got there, they called the police. But because the farm was so remote, it took almost an hour for officers to arrive. When the police finally showed up with two four-wheel drives, the narrator and Jeremy led them back to the container. And that's when things got worse. By the time they arrived, the container door was wide open and there was fire inside. Someone had already been there. They tried using the small fire extinguishers from the vehicles, but it barely slowed the flames. By the time the fire department arrived, most of the damage had already been done. Later, investigations found almost no remaining evidence of the equipment that had been inside, which which meant whoever ran the operation had likely been watching the CCTV. They saw Jeremy and the narrator enter the container and they came back quickly enough to remove most of the equipment before setting the place on fire to destroy the rest. The property was so large and there were so many ways in and out that whoever it was managed to disappear without a trace. The investigation eventually went cold. Even years later, the burnt shipping container is still sitting on that farm, too expensive to move, and the narrator says he'll never forget what he saw in those boxes. And this next story takes place in the Philippines about 12 years ago. Back then, the city where it happened was a lot quieter than it is today. And one student learned very quickly how different a city can feel once everyone else has gone home. About 12 years ago, the narrator was living in the Philippines as a foreign exchange student at a local university. They had been living there safely for years, and overall, the experience had been great. But there was one night they never forget. The city where the university was located is actually a pretty lively place. These days, it's full of restaurants, businesses, nightlife, and people walking around late into the night. But 12 years ago, it was completely different. Back then, most of the city shut down around 11 p.m. By 2 in the morning, the streets were practically deserted. If you didn't live directly in the city center, finding transportation home that late was almost impossible. And unfortunately, the narrator lived outside the city. At the time, they were in their senior year working on their thesis. Now, even though they could technically afford things like a personal car or computer, they preferred not to own them. They liked taking public transportation, and when it came to using the internet, they usually worked at internet cafes. They actually had a good friend who owned one right next to the university. Whenever they stayed late working, the friend would give them a discount on the computer time. Normally, the narrator would finish up and head home around 9 or 10 at night. But one particular evening, things didn't go according to plan. They had been writing their thesis by hand and now they needed to type everything out and print it. To make matters worse, their class schedule had kept them busy until about 8 p.m. and the deadline to submit the thesis 9 a.m. the next morning, which meant there was no room for delays and the last bus to their hometown left around 10 p.m. But there was no way they were going to finish everything in time. So they stayed at the internet cafe and kept working, typing, editing, printing, and time passed quickly. Before they realized it was already 2 in the morning. Finally, the work was done and they quickly packed everything up and rushed outside, hoping they might still find a ride home. In that city, motorcycles were a common form of public transportation. Drivers would often wait around late at night for passengers, but when the narrator stepped outside, the entire city looked like a ghost town. The streets were empty and completely silent. Many of the streetlights weren't even working, leaving long stretches of road in total darkness. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. The silence was so intense that you could probably hear something drop several meters away. Feeling uneasy, the narrator started walking faster, trying not to panic, trying not to run. They turned a corner and stepped towards the street. That's when they noticed two men standing beside a motorcycle, both of them wearing faded jeans and one had on a camouflage jacket. And they were talking quietly to each other. But as soon as the narrator walked past them, the two men stopped talking. Immediately, alarm bells started going off. Everything about the situation felt wrong, and the narrator quickly crossed the street and kept walking. And that's when they heard one of the men whisper something. "Give me the towel." In that area, that phrase often meant someone was being handed something wrapped inside cloth, usually a knife. A few seconds later, the narrator heard footsteps behind them, fast footsteps. That's when they started running. Originally, they had planned to go to the motorcycle parking lot to try and find a ride home. But the lot was located down another dark street with no lights. Running down that road suddenly felt like a terrible idea. Instead, they stayed on the main road, which at least had a few working lights. Past a small pension house, but there was no guard outside. They kept running. Somewhere further down the road, there was supposed to be a hotel, a nightclub, even a hospital. But all of these places felt way too far away. By the time they reached at the end of the block, the footsteps behind them suddenly stopped. They turned around. The man chasing them was gone. For a second, they thought maybe they had lost him. But then they heard something else. The motorcycle engine starting. Their heart dropped. Now the two men were searching for them on the bike. Thinking quickly, the narrator turned down a dark alley and slipped into a narrow hallway that led back towards the main road. If they were going to hide, the darkness might actually help. They stayed completely still, and moments later, the motorcycle slowly passed by the entrance of the alley. The two men looked around, but they didn't stop. Still, the narrator knew that they might come back. If they don't find them on the road, eventually they might check the alley, so they didn't wait. They ran through the hallway, exited on the other side, crossed the main street again, and sprinted towards the intersection was a bank, and standing outside the bank were two armed security guards. The narrator ran straight towards them. Out of breath, they explained everything that had just happened. The guards immediately told them to stay there, and they stood watch while keeping an eye on the street. The narrator stayed with them for almost an hour, and eventually the streets remained quiet. No sign of the two men returning. After thanking the guards, the narrator jogged to a nearby hotel and rented a room for the night. Only then did they finally feel safe enough to call their father and explain what had happened. Looking back, they still think about how easily that night could have gone differently. If they had taken the dark road towards the motorcycle parking lot, and if they had assumed they would find a ride waiting there probably shouldn't have been anyone around to see or hear what happened. And in a city that is empty at 2 a.m., no one would have known where they disappeared to. So, that's another one of the stories of where timing probably saved someone. And if those security guards hadn't been standing outside the bank, or if the narrator had chosen a different street to run down, that night might have turned out very differently. It's a good reminder that when something feels wrong, trusting that instinct can make a huge difference. Alright, so that's going to wrap up today's stories. And if you enjoyed listening to these kinds of real creepy encounters, make sure you stick around because I'll definitely be sharing more stories like this. And if you have a creepy story of your own that you want to share, feel free to drop it in the comments. But for now, stay safe out there and I'll see you in the next one.